She filmed him, zipped inside a suitcase, begging her to let him out, telling her he couldn't breathe. And on the video, she's laughing. The next morning, he was dead. And her explanation to police was that they'd been playing hide-and-seek. This is the case that took a Florida jury less than a day to decide. But it took the court system 4 years and 13 defense attorneys to get there. February 2020. Winter Park, Florida. A quiet apartment on France Lane. By the next afternoon, Sarah Boone would call 911 and say 4 words that would open one of the strangest murder cases in recent Florida history. My boyfriend is dead. The man inside the suitcase was 42-year-old Jorge Torres Jr. Here's what actually happened that night, and why, even with video evidence, this case took years to close. Before the suitcase, there was the relationship, and it wasn't a healthy one. Boone and Torres had been together on and off, with a history both sides would later describe as volatile. At trial, Boone's defense would argue she was a victim of ongoing abuse, what her attorneys called battered spouse syndrome. She later testified that Torres had physically and sexually abused her throughout their relationship. Prosecutors didn't deny the relationship was troubled. What they argued was that none of it, whatever happened before that night, justified what came next. On the night in question, the two had been drinking. According to Boone's own statements to investigators, they'd been playing a drinking game, and at some point, it turned into a game of hide-and-seek. Torres climbed into a suitcase. Boone zipped it shut. That much everyone agrees on. What happened after is where the story turns. Boone didn't just leave Torres in the suitcase. She recorded it. In the footage, later shown to the jury, Torres can be heard telling her he can't breathe. He says her name. He asks her to let him out. Her response, according to court testimony, "That's on you." He says it again. She says it again. At another point in the recording, prosecutors say Boone can be heard referencing his infidelity, telling him this is what it feels like when he cheats on her. She did not let him out. Instead, according to her own testimony, she went upstairs. She said she was afraid he'd break out of the suitcase, so at one point she admitted to striking it with a bat. She went to bed. By the time she checked on him again, hours had passed. At 1:01 p.m. the next day, Boone called 911. "My boyfriend is dead," she told the dispatcher. When Orange County deputies arrived, they found Torres still inside the suitcase, unresponsive. Boone told them the same story she'd tell for years afterward, that it was a game, that he'd climbed involuntarily, that she believed he could free himself. She was arrested that same day and charged with second-degree murder. Here's the part most true crime coverage skips. The case almost didn't make it to trial at all, not because of the evidence, but because of the legal chaos that followed. Over the next 4 years, Boone went through attorney after attorney. By the time her case finally reached trial, she had at least 8, and by the appeals process, 13. At one point, frustrated with the pace of her defense, she chose to represent herself in court, before eventually returning to counsel. The trial that was originally supposed to happen within a year or 2 of her arrest didn't start until May 2024, more than 4 years after Torres died. For the Torres family, that meant 4 years of waiting for a case that had video evidence from day one. When the trial finally began, the centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the same video Boone had recorded herself. Prosecutor Dave Cacciatore played it for the jury, Torres's voice muffled through the suitcase fabric, saying he couldn't breathe. Boone's voice, unmoved, telling him it was his own fault. Crime scene investigators walked the jury through the physical evidence, including the suitcase itself, brought into the courtroom. Boone took the stand in her own defense. She didn't deny zipping the suitcase. She didn't deny hitting it with a bat. What she argued was that her fear, in the moment, came from years of abuse, that she believed Torres could get himself out, and that she never intended for him to die. She testified to a pattern of past violence at his hands, describing incidents of being hit, spat on, choked, and worse. The prosecution's response wasn't to argue that abuse never happened. It was to argue that nothing in that video, her laughter, her taunting, her refusal to open the zipper, looked like fear. It looked, they said, like someone enjoying it. The jury deliberated. In October 2024, they returned a verdict guilty of second-degree murder. Sentencing came in December 2024. Boone faced up to life in prison. Before the judge ruled, the courtroom heard from both sides of her life. Two women who'd served time with Boone spoke on her behalf, along with a jail chaplain, describing a different side of her than the one on the video. But the Torres family's statements were the ones that landed hardest. His mother, Blanca Torres, told the court that Boone hadn't just killed her son. She'd killed a father, a brother, an uncle. His sister, Victoria, said Boone had caused a lifetime of pain, that something as simple as closing a suitcase now felt like a trigger for their family. Boone herself addressed the court. She described the abuse. She says she suffered at Torres's hands in graphic terms, and said that despite everything, she still loved him and forgave him. But she also said she forgave herself for loving a man capable of that violence. It wasn't enough to move the judge toward leniency. Sarah Boone was sentenced to life in prison. Her attorney said afterward they were surprised the judge showed no mercy, and that an appeal, while possible, could take years. Jorge Torres Jr. died zipped inside a suitcase in his own home, while the person he was with recorded it happening. Sarah Boone will spend the rest of her life in prison for it, a sentence that came 4 years, 13 attorneys, and 1 jury verdict after that night in Winter Park. If you want to see how the courts handle cases where abuse and violence intersect, where both things can be true at once, that's a much longer conversation. Let me know in the comments if you want that one next.